Today I'm building this Scandinavian Modern round table, or is it Mid-Century Modern? We had a little bit of a discussion here behind the scenes here on what was what, but the client is from Sweden and she called it Scandinavian, so that's what I'm going with. You can decide for yourself. So far what you've been watching is me getting the material planed down for the top. Once I got everything planed to thickness, I took a few minutes to decide which pieces look good together to get the best grain flow. Then I glued them up. In my last video I showed how I made this simple fully adjustable circle cutting jig. I used it to cut out the circle. I'm using a large thumbnail bit to create a pillowed edge. Since it is so large, I did the cut in several passes. To achieve the look I'm going for, I cut the profile on both the top and the bottom. If you look closely, you can see where the router bit stopped and the flat part of the table started. I gently blended them together with a sander. Then I came back and feathered any inconsistencies together by hand. Now on to the legs. I don't have an exact plan for the size or shape of the legs. I just have an idea in my head of what I want them to look like. So I drew in some guidelines of how tall the table should be along with the center line. Then I just started sketching and I spent a few minutes drawing in different angles and curves until I found one that I liked. This piece of plywood will end up being my template to route all the legs to the same shape. Then I started cutting the plywood down. I did all the straight cuts at the track saw and then did the final curves at the bandsaw. At the spindle sander, I finessed the final curve and sanded out any bandsaw marks left behind. Even a decent plywood grade is junk these days. I didn't want the bearing of the router bit to get off course when it goes over the voids in the plywood, so I just filled them up with some CA glue and then sanded them flush. After all that, I decided I didn't like the angle of the legs, but I liked the curve at the top. So I cut the angle of the legs on another piece of plywood and stuck it to the old piece so I could copy the shape of the curve onto the new template. Now that I was happy with the shape of the legs, I needed to build a fence to attach to the template so I could use it to line up the legs and clamp them down. I added some toggle clamps to help hold the legs in place during routing. Now that the template was done, I used it to take measurements from so I could figure out what angles to cut the legs and apron at. I cut the angles at the chop saw, and after doing so I ended up recutting them off camera at the table saw. A chop saw may be accurate enough to cut crown molding, but the blade seems to just flex just enough when cutting through this thick lumber that the joint doesn't close tight in the center. Once I got the joints fitting tight, I marked for floating tenons and headed off to cut the joinery. Since the pieces are angled, to help hold them in place while I cut the mortises, I screwed a strip of scrap wood to the bench and used the bench dog to help hold the workpiece by wedging it in place. Since the bench dog pivoted, it worked for holding all the pieces regardless of the different angles they were cut at. Since the miter and the legs are cut at a shallow angle, I didn't want the domino to blow through to the outside edge. So I set the domino to cut a shallower depth on the tip of the miter and custom cut the tenon stock at the appropriate length. At this point I'm only gluing the floating tenons in on one side. This way I can do test fits and still take them apart while working on other aspects of the legs. I put each leg against the template and traced the shape of the curve against the angles so I could rough them in on the bandsaw. I fitted the legs together and used a flush trim bit to clean them up at the router table to match the template. I pulled the legs apart and did the last little bit of layout for the last joint that needed to be cut. The cross braces are going to cross each other with a half flap joint in the center of the table. Since I have extra material on the ends for the angled joints, the piece is just too tall to cut a half lap at the table saw, so I'm going to cut it by hand. I scribed the width of the workpiece using a marking knife. Then I used the chisel to set a groove for the saw to track in. I used my Japanese pole saw to cut a kerf on each side down to my layout line, and then I chiseled out the waist. To be sure my half lap joint would not overlap by more than half, I took care to get a perfectly square bottom by setting up a guide block to pare down on the last few chisel passes. I did a test fit and it was just a little tight, so I pared down the size to widen the joint just enough. Once I was happy with the fit, I used my knife to scribe the joint location on the other side and cut it out using the same process. After a few test fits and adjustments, here's a moment of truth. I'm pretty happy with that fit up. To attach the legs to the top, I'm going to use screws. So at the drill press, I countersunk and pre-drilled some holes before shaping the legs. Drilling into a flat surface is much easier than drilling into a round surface. To shape the legs, I'm going to use a really large roundover bit with a bearing on it. When I pass by the screw holes, there's a good chance that the bearing will dive into them and ruin my workpiece. To prevent this, I cut a few short sections of dowel to temporarily plug the holes. No glue, it's just a friction fit. I want the legs to taper from all sides, so to cut the final tapers on the faces of the legs, I stuck them to a piece of plywood at the angle I wanted to cut the taper at, and then I cut the waist off at the bandsaw. Of course, the bandsaw left some saw marks, so I just cleaned them up at the joiner. Then I glued the legs up in 2 sub-assemblies. Since I tapered the legs their full length, as a result the legs are no longer flush where they join the cross pieces, so I took my jack plane and feathered the 2 pieces back smooth again. I'm finally ready to round over the legs and create a nice pillowed edge. To prep the legs for the router, I used CA glue to glue on a sacrificial block to protect the end grain. If you've ever tried to start a router bit on the end grain, you know that 99.9999999% of the time the bit will catch and tear up that end grain. This little block will give me a safe and solid starting point. I rounded over all the parts at the router table. When I built my table, that video will be coming out soon, I designed it as big as I could and still have enough room to walk around and work in my shop. The extra tabletop size adds enough stability to route large awkward pieces safely. Just like the top, I did it in several passes, raising the bit little by little with each pass until I got to the shape that I wanted. Now that I'm done with the router, a quick whack with the mallet takes care of that little piece of plywood. I test fitted the 2 pieces together. This final detail not many people will ever see, but if your grandma gets down on the floor to play with the great-grandkids and she realizes she can't get up, she will at least have some nice joinery to look at while she waits for help to arrive. I used the chisel to round over and blend in the intersection together. This one's for you, Grandma. After test fitting it, I decided I still didn't like the shape of the legs. They just seemed too thick, so I used my jack plane to reduce the thickness and re-round over the edge. I then came back with a sander and feathered out all the hand plane marks and refined the pillow. I think we're pretty good. I like that shape a lot better now. I glued the two leg assemblies together. Then tapped out the temporary plug so I could screw it to the top. And of course, prior to final assembly, I applied several coats of a clear satin poly. I think it turned out to be a pretty good looking Scandinavian modern table. Thank you for making it this far. If you want to see what I'm working on now, please give me a follow on Instagram. And of course, if you are not already subscribed, do so. Hit the bell to be notified when the next video comes out. Thanks for watching.